My son and his wife left for a company party, leaving me alone with the housekeeper they believed couldn't speak a word of English. The moment their car disappeared down the street, she grabbed my teacup, poured it straight into the sink, then turned to me and said in flawless English, "Don't drink this. Pack your things and leave now. You're in danger." Instead of panicking, I smiled and quietly replied, "I've known you understood English since your first few days here." Her face turned completely pale. "I'm so grateful you're here with me today on Revenge, Dad. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country are you watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. A quick note, this story contains fictional elements crafted for entertainment and reflection. Any similarity to names or places is coincidental, but everything it teaches you is worth keeping. The house on Oak Hollow Lane was never meant to be lived in alone. I know that because I built it myself. Every wall, every beam, every carefully fitted joint in the hardwood floors that Margaret had picked out from a catalog in the summer of 1987. She had spread that catalog across the kitchen table of our old apartment in Glendale, jabbing her finger at a photograph of wide plank white oak and saying, "That one, Ed, that's the one we want." I had told her it was expensive. She had looked at me with those dark eyes of hers and said, "Most things worth having are." She was right, as she tended to be about most things. I finished the house in 1991. We moved in on a Tuesday in October, carrying boxes through a front door. I had hung myself slightly crooked, which Margaret never let me forget, and never once asked me to fix. 32 years, we lived there together, raised Ryan in the back bedroom that caught the morning light, watched the pepper trees in the garden grow tall enough to shade the whole eastern side of the yard, built a life the way you build a house, one careful piece at a time, making sure each new thing rests solidly on what came before. Margaret died on a Thursday morning in July of 2023, in the bedroom we had shared for 3 decades, with the windows open and the sound of the neighbors' sprinklers going in the early heat. She went quietly, which was not like her at all. Margaret had opinions about everything and expressed every one of them at full volume. The quiet she left behind was the loudest thing I had ever heard. For 14 months after that, I lived in the house alone. I am not a man who complains about solitude. I had my workshop in the garage, 347 clocks in various states of repair, each one a small mechanical puzzle waiting to be understood. I had my morning coffee on the back porch. I had the pepper trees and the dry Pasadena heat, and the particular amber light that came through the kitchen windows at 4 in the afternoon. I was not happy exactly, but I was functional. I was managing. Then Ryan called. It was a Sunday evening in February, and I was in the workshop reassembling a 19th century Vienna regulator that had come to me in a cardboard box with 17 of its parts loose and one of them missing entirely. My phone buzzed on the workbench, and my son's name appeared on the screen, and I felt, I will be honest, a small involuntary warmth in my chest before I answered. Ryan and I had not spoken much since his mother's funeral, not because of any argument, simply because grief makes people either reach toward each other or pull away, and Ryan had always been a puller. "Dad," he said, and his voice had that careful quality, the over-controlled tone of someone who has rehearsed what they are about to say. "Melissa and I have been talking. We're worried about you. Being out there alone in that big house, it's not right." "I'm fine, Ryan," I said, because it was mostly true. "We want to come stay with you, help out, keep you company." He paused, and I heard Melissa's voice in the background, low and deliberate. "We've already talked to my firm about working remotely. Melissa can consult from anywhere. It makes sense, Dad." They arrived on a Saturday morning in March with 2 cars loaded to the roof lines. Melissa stepped out of the passenger seat looking fresh and purposeful, her dark hair pulled back, her smile, the kind that reaches the eyes without necessarily starting there. "Edward," she said, hugging me with the precise warmth of someone who has decided to hug you. "We are going to take such good care of you." Ryan shook my hand. His grip was firm as always, but he did not quite meet my eyes, and that was new. The first week was pleasant enough on the surface, but it was the questions that stayed with me after the lights went out. On the 4th day, Melissa asked about the insurance policy on the house. On the 6th, she asked about my retirement accounts. On the 9th, she walked into my workshop, looked around at 347 clocks that had passed through Margaret's hands, and asked whether I had ever had them properly appraised. "Some of these must be worth real money," she said, her tone shifting into something softer than concern. I looked at this woman my son had married standing in the room where Margaret's fingerprints still lived on the brass and glass of things she had loved, and felt my chest go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. "I take very good care of my clocks," I said pleasantly. She smiled and went back inside. I set down the French mantel clock I had been holding and listened to Melissa's footsteps crossing the kitchen floor above me. A man who has spent 40 years diagnosing broken mechanisms learns to hear the difference between a clock that is simply running slow and one that has been deliberately set wrong. Something in this house had begun running just slightly off, and I was the only one who had noticed. Sofia Alvarez arrived on a Tuesday morning in April with a single canvas bag and a pair of dark eyes that, in my experience, understood everything they looked at. Melissa had announced the hiring 3 days earlier, over dinner, with the particular brightness she reserved for decisions she had already made and was now presenting as suggestions. "Edward, I've been thinking," she said, refilling her wine glass without being asked. "This house is a lot to manage. Ryan and I are working all day, and I don't want you to feel like the upkeep is falling on your shoulders." She reached across the table and patted my hand. Her fingers were cool and dry. "I found someone through an agency, a housekeeper. She comes very highly recommended. I've been managing this house for 30 years, I said, keeping my voice mild. "Of course you have," Melissa said warmly, as though I had said something adorable. "But you deserve help, Edward. You deserve to rest." Ryan was cutting his chicken with great concentration and did not look up, so Sophia came. She was 34 years old, compact and precise in her movements, with the kind of physical economy that belongs to people who have learned not to waste anything. Not energy, not space, not words. Melissa introduced her in the kitchen doorway, with the same tone she might use to introduce a new appliance. "Edward, this is Sophia. She doesn't speak much English, I'm afraid, but she's absolutely wonderful at what she does. We'll manage." Sophia stood with her hands folded in front of her and gave me a small, polite nod. I welcomed her in my approximate Spanish 40 years of working alongside craftsmen from Oaxaca, and Puebla had left me with a handful of phrases, none of them particularly elegant. She replied with a quiet, "Thank you," and looked at the floor. Melissa beamed as though she had arranged something clever. Over the following 2 weeks, I watched Sophia work. She was exceptionally good at it. The house had not been so clean since Margaret's time, and meals appeared with a quiet efficiency that would have impressed a short-order cook. But it was not her work that interested me. It was the small things that did not fit. On her 3rd day, I was reading the Los Angeles Times at the kitchen table when I dropped a section of the paper. It hit the floor with a sharp crack, and Sophia, who was wiping down the counter with her back to me, flinched and turned toward the sound before I had said a single word. I noted that. A person who does not understand English does not orient themselves towards sudden sounds any faster than anyone else. But a person who is paying attention to everything, including the words they are pretending not to hear, develops a particular hair-trigger awareness of the environment. I had seen it before in men who worked in loud machine shops and learned to read the room without relying on sound at all. On her 7th day, I left the Times folded open to the opinion section on the kitchen table while I went to answer the door. When I came back, Sophia was wiping down the table around the newspaper, and her eyes were moving along the columns of text. Not glancing, not skimming, but reading the way a person reads when they cannot help themselves. I said nothing. I sat back down and drank my coffee and thought about it. On her 12th day, Ryan told a joke at dinner, something he had heard at work mildly funny, the kind of joke that lands better with the right delivery than with the actual content. Sophia was clearing the salad plates when the punchline arrived, and for just under 1 second, I would estimate it at no more than 800 milliseconds. The corner of her mouth pulled upward before she caught it and rearranged her face into polite blankness. She covered it by turning toward the kitchen. Ryan did not notice. Melissa did not notice. I noticed. I did not say anything then either. A man who has spent 4 decades working with mechanisms that run on tolerances measured in hundredths of a millimeter learns that the most important information is almost always in the details that seem too small to matter. I filed Sophia away in the careful mental ledger I had been keeping since March and turned my attention to the other thing that had begun to concern me: the pills. My blood pressure medication had been prescribed by Dr. Patricia Walsh at her practice in Arcadia 11 years ago. I had been on the same formulation for so long that that I could have identified it in the dark small, round the specific pale blue of a clear November sky with a slight chalky texture when you press them between your fingers. I took one every morning, with breakfast had done so without interruption for over a decade. In the third week of April, I picked up my pill organizer at breakfast and felt before I even opened it that something was different. The weight was fractionally off. I opened the Tuesday compartment and looked at what was inside. The pill was the right size, the right general shape, but the color was wrong, not dramatically wrong. Not the kind of wrong that shouts at you, but the kind that whispers. It was a shade or two lighter than it should have been, with a slightly different sheen under the kitchen light. The texture when I pressed it was smoother. I closed the compartment. I looked up. Ryan was checking his phone. Melissa was spreading jam on her toast with focused attention. I said, "I think I'll take my pill a little later today. Stomach's a bit unsettled." "Of course," Melissa said, without looking up from her toast. "Take your time." I went to the workshop, opened the small safe I kept behind the third shelf of the parts cabinet. The one Melissa had not yet worked out was a safe because it looked exactly like a section of shelving, and I placed the pill inside. Then I got my phone and called Dr. Patricia Walsh's office. Her nurse put me through within 10 minutes, which was one of the things I had always valued about Patricia Walsh. She was a direct woman in her early 50s who wore her gray hair short and her patients long, and she had been my doctor since a mutual friend had recommended her the year after Margaret's diagnosis. "Ed," she said, "what's going on?" "I need you to run a comparison," I said. "I'm going to bring you something this afternoon. I need to know if it matches my current prescription." There was a pause on the line, brief professional. "Are you telling me what I think you're telling me?" "I'm telling you I want a chemical analysis," I said. "And Patricia, I need this to be quiet for now. No calls to the house, no messages that Ryan or Melissa might see." Another pause longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted into something careful and deliberate, the tone of a physician who has just understood the shape of a situation she does not like. "Ed," she said slowly, "if this is what I think it is, there are reporting requirements I'm obligated to follow. California law is very specific about suspected elder abuse. I can't promise you quiet indefinitely." "I know the law," I said. "I'm not asking you to break it. I'm asking you to wait until I've had a chance to understand exactly what I'm dealing with. A week, maybe 2. She was quiet for a moment. I could hear her tapping her pen against her desk, a habit of hers, when she was thinking hard. "Bring me the pill," she said finally. "I'll run the analysis today. But, Ed, if this comes back the way I think it might, we are going to have a serious conversation about next steps." "Understood." "Understood," I said. "Thank you, Patricia." I drove to Arcadia that afternoon, told Ryan and Melissa I was going to the hardware store on Foothill, and was back within 2 hours. I replaced the suspicious pill with one of my actual spares. I had kept a small backup supply in the workshop safe since the first time I had noticed the color discrepancy, and sat down at my workbench to wait. The workshop was quiet around me, 347 mechanisms keeping their time without comment or complaint. "All right, Margaret," I said. "Let's see how bad this is." The answer, as it turned out, was bad enough. The results came back on a Thursday morning, 6 days after I had driven to Arcadia, with a pill in a Ziploc bag and a suspicion I had not yet allowed myself to name out loud. Dr. Patricia Walsh called my cell phone at 8:47. I was in the workshop trying without much success to concentrate on a Seth Thomas mantle clock that needed a new suspension spring, and when I saw her name on the screen, my hands went very still on the workbench. "Epo," she said, and the way she said my name carefully, the way you carry something fragile, told me everything before she said another word. "I need you to come in this morning, not this afternoon, this morning." I was in her office by 10. Patricia Walsh's practice was in a low beige building on Duarte Road in Arcadia, sandwiched between a physical therapy clinic and an insurance office, the kind of thoroughly ordinary building that makes you feel somehow that everything inside it must be reliable and true. I had been coming there for 11 years. The waiting room had the same watercolor prints of California poppies on the walls that had been there when I first walked in, and the receptionist, a cheerful woman named Donna, always remembered that I took my coffee without sugar. That morning, Donna did not offer me coffee. She showed me straight back. Patricia was standing behind her desk when I came in, which she did not normally do. She was a compact woman with sharp gray eyes and the kind of posture that suggested she had made a decision and was prepared to defend it. She gestured to the chair across from her, and I sat down, and she sat down, and she placed a folder on the desk between us. "The pill you brought me," she said, "is not your blood pressure medication." My stomach dropped, though I had been expecting it. There is a particular kind of sick feeling that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation, from the moment when the thing you feared stops being a fear and becomes a fact. My hands tightened on the arms of the chair, and I made myself breathe evenly. "What is it?" I asked. "It's a low-dose sedative," Patricia said, her voice flat and precise. "Nothing that would show up dramatically, nothing that would put you on the floor. But taken daily over a period of weeks, it would make you tired, foggy, slow to recall things. It would make you look to a casual observer, like a man whose cognitive function was declining." She paused, and I could see the anger working in her jaw, the way it does in people who are furious but have decided that fury is not currently useful. "Ed, someone replaced your blood pressure medication with a sedative. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "There's more." She opened the folder. "I also ran an analysis on the tea sample you left with Donna last week, the one you said tasted off. I had almost forgotten I had done, that had almost dismissed it as overcaution. There's a compound in it, mild. The kind of thing you might find in an over-the-counter sleep aid broken down and dissolved. Enough to take the edge off your alertness without being detectable by taste if you weren't paying close attention." The room felt very quiet. Outside the window, a truck was backing up somewhere on Duarte Road, its warning beep coming in steady mechanical pulses. "How long?" I asked. Hard to say without knowing when it started, but the effects would be cumulative. 2 months of this, or Ed and you would genuinely present as a man with significant cognitive decline. You would be forgetful, unsteady, easily confused. She closed the folder. Someone has been engineering that outcome very deliberately. I thought about Melissa refilling her wine glass at dinner. I thought about Ryan cutting his chicken without looking up. I thought about the way Melissa's hand had felt on mine, cool, dry, precisely warm enough to seem affectionate. "Patricia," I said, "what are you required to do now?" She did not hesitate. She had clearly already made this decision before I arrived. "California. Welfare and Institutions Code, Section 15,630, requires mandated reporters, which includes physicians, to report known or suspected abuse of an elder to Adult Protective Services within 2 working days of observing or receiving information about it." She met my eyes directly. "I'm filing a report with APS this afternoon, Ed. I don't have a choice in that, and I wouldn't make a different one if I did." "I know," I said. "I told you do what the law requires. I was counting on it." Something shifted in her expression. The clinical precision gave way briefly to something that looked like it hurt. "Ed, how long have you known something was wrong?" "Since April," I said. "Maybe earlier if I am honest about when I started noticing things I wasn't ready to name." Patricia pressed her lips together and looked at the folder on her desk. Her fingers were very tight around her pen. "Who is doing this to you?" I told her. Not everything, not the full architecture of what I suspected, not the conversations I had replayed in my mind at 2 a.m, not the particular coldness of realizing that the person orchestrating this was someone who called me by my first name and cooked dinner in my kitchen, but enough. Enough for Patricia Walsh to sit back in her chair with an expression of such concentrated, controlled anger that for a moment she looked like a completely different person. "All right," she said quietly. "A PS will investigate. They'll coordinate with LAPD. There's an elder abuse unit and cases like this go to them. But Ed," she leaned forward, "you need a lawyer, today, not next week, today." I was already reaching for my phone. Frank Calloway had been my attorney for 30 years, and my friend for longer than that. We had met in 1993 at a clock auction in Pasadena. He had been bidding on a 19th century Austrian bracket clock that I had wanted badly, and he had outbid me, and afterward he had come over and introduced himself and said with a grin that I would come to recognize as his standard operating expression, "Sorry about the clock, can I buy you a beer instead?" He had the clock on his office wall to this day. I had never entirely forgiven him for it, which was the foundation of a very solid friendship. His office was on the 18th floor of a building on South Flower Street in downtown Los Angeles, with a view of the financial district that he claimed not to care about, and very clearly did. When I called him from the parking lot of Patricia's practice, he picked up on the second ring. "Ed," he said, "this is either about the Dodgers or something serious." "Something serious," I said. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Frank Calloway did not do things with 4 seconds of silence unless he was giving a situation the full weight it deserved. "Talk to me," he said. I talked. I sat in my car in the parking lot on Duarte Road, with the California sun coming through the windshield and the air conditioning running, and told Frank Calloway everything: the pills, the tea, the questions about insurance and bank accounts, and the value of the clocks, the careful performance of concern that Ryan and Melissa had been staging in my living room for 2 months. When I finished, my throat was tight in a way I had not expected, a physical ache that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than words. Frank was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was very controlled, and beneath the control was something that sounded a great deal like fury. "Okay," he said, "here's what happens now. I'm going to contact APS this afternoon before they contact you, so we get ahead of this. I also know someone at LAPD's Elder Abuse Unit, Detective Carla Reyes. She's handled cases like this before, and she is exactly the kind of person you want on your side." He paused. "But Ed and I need you to hear this clearly. We cannot move too fast. If we act now with what we have, they lawyer up, they destroy evidence, and we get them on a misdemeanor at best. We need them to go further. We need them to take the last step themselves." "The 911 call," I said. "Exactly." Frank's voice was steady and certain, the voice of a man who has navigated difficult terrain before and knows where the solid ground is. "When they make that call, there is no walking it back. That is the moment we have everything we need." Another pause. "Can you go back in there and act like nothing has changed?" I looked through the windshield at the ordinary beige building, with its watercolor poppies and its parking lot baking in the May sun, and I thought about Margaret, who had always said I was the most stubborn man she had ever loved, and who had meant it as a compliment. "Frank," I said, "I have been acting like nothing has changed for 2 months. I think I can manage a little longer." He exhaled a long, slow breath that carried the weight of everything we had just agreed to. "All right," he said. "Then we wait. But, Ed, you call me every week, and you be careful." "I'm always careful," I said. "I know," he said. "That's the only reason I'm not more scared right now." I drove home the long way through the back streets of Arcadia and into Pasadena, past the pepper trees and the old craftsman houses and the wide, unhurried boulevards of a city that had been there long before any of this and would be there long after. When I pulled into the driveway on Oak Hollow Lane, Melissa's car was in its usual spot, and the kitchen light was on, and through the window I could see her moving around the kitchen, preparing dinner with the focused efficiency she brought to everything. I sat in the car for a moment, my hands on the steering wheel, and let myself feel fully, and without managing it, the grief and the fury and the particular exhaustion of a man who has just confirmed that the worst thing he suspected is true. Then I got out of the car, walked through the front door, hung my keys on the hook where they always went, and called out, "Something smells good. What are we having?" Melissa smiled at me from the kitchen doorway, warm and bright and exactly as she always was. "Your favorite," she said. "Pot roast." "Wonderful," I said, and smiled back at her and meant absolutely none of it. The 2 months between May and July were the longest of my life, and I have lived through some considerable stretches of time that did not want to pass. I want to be clear about what those months required of me, because I think people sometimes imagine that pretending is easy, that if you know the truth, the performance becomes simple, a matter of just saying the opposite of what you feel. That is not how it works. Pretending done properly is exhausting in a way that goes all the way down to the bone. It means smiling when your chest is full of something cold and heavy. It means saying, "Thank you, that smells wonderful," when someone sets a bowl of soup in front of you that you have no intention of touching. It means watching every single day the person who is dismantling your life from the inside and giving them absolutely nothing to work with. I became very good at it. The medication was the most delicate part. I had kept a small backup supply of my actual blood pressure pills in the workshop, safe from the moment I first noticed the substitution. Each morning, I performed the same ritual, picking up the counterfeit pill, appearing to swallow it with my coffee, then disposing of it in the workshop later. But I also understood that Melissa was watching for results. If I remained visibly sharp and alert, she would suspect. So I began performing a gradual, careful decline, slightly slower responses in the afternoon, occasional pauses before answering simple questions, a tendency to repeat myself that I calibrated precisely enough to seem organic rather than theatrical. I was in the end a better actor than any of them had credited me for being. Melissa continued her questions about the accounts, about the insurance, about what I intended to do with the workshop, eventually. I continued my answers carefully, vague occasionally, contradicting myself in small ways that seemed like the natural forgetfulness of a man my age, rather than a deliberate strategy. Ryan watched these exchanges with an expression I had learned to read, a tightness around the eyes, a slight forward lean that he would catch and correct, as though part of him was always on the verge of saying something he had decided not to say. Sophia moved through the house with her usual quiet precision, and I watched her watch them, and felt in a way I had not expected something close to gratitude. The package from Frank arrived on a Wednesday morning in early July, addressed to me at a post office box I had maintained for business correspondence since 1998. I picked it up on my way back from what I told Ryan and Melissa was a dentist appointment, which was not entirely a lie. I had in fact stopped at my dentist's office on Colorado Boulevard to pick up some paperwork, because if you are going to construct a cover story, you might as well make it verifiable. The package contained a small device that looked to any casual inspection like an ordinary USB charging block, the kind that sits in a wall outlet and powers a phone. It was, according to the handwritten note Frank had enclosed in his distinctly cramped handwriting, considerably more than that. The note said, "Audio quality is excellent. Range covers a standard bedroom. Battery life 30 days. Instructions enclosed. Call me when it's placed. F." Beneath the note was a single sheet of paper with a diagram and 6 numbered steps printed in the same small, precise font that Frank used for everything, as though he had decided at some point in his life that clarity was a form of respect and had never deviated from that position. I placed the package in the workshop safe and waited for my opportunity. It came 3 evenings later on a Saturday when Ryan and Melissa went to dinner in Pasadena with a couple they had known since college, people I had met twice. Pleasant enough, the kind of friends who appear in your life as context rather than characters. They left at 6:30, dressed nicely, Melissa in a green dress that cost more than my first car, Ryan holding the door for her, with the automatic courtesy of a man who has been trained rather than moved. "Don't wait up, Edward," Melissa said, pausing in the doorway with her hand on the frame, backlit by the porch light. "We'll probably be late." "I never wait up," I said pleasantly. "Have a lovely evening." The moment their taillights disappeared around the corner of Oak Hollow Lane, I went to the workshop, retrieved the package, and came back inside. I was standing at the kitchen counter, reading Frank's 6-step instructions for the 3rd time, when I heard footsteps in the hallway, and Sophia appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was still wearing her gray work uniform, a dish towel folded over one arm, and she stopped when she saw me, stopped and looked at the device in my hand and the instruction sheet on the counter. And for just a moment, her composure cracked open like a fault line, and something very alert and very awake looked out from behind her eyes. I set the instructions down. "Sophia," I said in perfectly ordinary English, "I wonder if you might help me with something." The dish towel slipped off her arm and hit the floor, and she stared at me, and the color left her face so completely that I was briefly concerned she might need to sit down. Her hand went to the counter to steady herself, and I could see her pulse jumping at her throat, rapid and visible, the physical evidence of a woman whose entire carefully constructed situation had just shifted beneath her feet. "You..." She started and stopped, started again. "You speak to me in English." "I have always spoken English," I said. "I was waiting for the right moment." "You knew." Her voice was barely above a whisper, and it was not a question. Her eyes were wide and dark, and searching my face with an intensity that reminded me oddly of the way a good watchmaker examines a movement under magnification, looking for the thing that is not immediately obvious, but is, once you see it, impossible to miss. "How long have you known?" "Since approximately your 3rd day," I said. "The newspaper. You were reading it when you thought I wasn't looking." I paused. "Also, you laughed at Ryan's joke before you caught yourself, and you turned towards sound before it registers visually, which is what people do when they understand the language well enough to anticipate rather than react." Sophia pressed her hand flat against the counter, and I could see that her fingers were trembling, a fine involuntary tremor that she was working very hard to control and not quite managing. "I am not a spy," she said, and the words came out with a force that surprised me, as though she had been waiting to say them to someone. "I want you to know that. Whatever you think, I was not hired to watch you. I was not sent by anyone. I needed work, and I was afraid that if employers knew I spoke English, they would." She stopped, swallowed. "It is complicated." "It usually is," I said. "Sit down, Sophia." She looked at the kitchen stool as though she was not entirely sure her legs would carry her to it. But she made it, and she sat down, and she pressed both hands flat on the counter in front of her, and took a breath that was not quite steady. "I have heard things," she said, "in this house, things they said in front of me, because they believed I could not understand." Her jaw tightened, and in her eyes I saw something that was not fear anymore. It was anger, the particular anger of a person who has witnessed something deeply wrong and has been carrying the weight of that knowledge alone. "Things about you, Mr. Brooks, things they are planning to do." "I know," I said. She blinked. "You know, not all of it, but enough to understand the shape of it." I picked up Frank's instruction sheet and held it out to her. "Which is why I need your help. I need to place this device in the room where Ryan and Melissa sleep. I need you to put it there, because you have access to that room in a way that I prefer not to exercise directly." I watched her look at the sheet, watched her read it with the quick, comprehensive attention of someone accustomed to processing information rapidly. "I have been watching you for 3 months, Sophia. Not with suspicion, with attention. There is a difference. I know how you move through this house. I know what you notice. I know that you have been carrying something heavy for a long time and have not put it down. That tells me what I need to know about your character." I paused. "The man who sent this is my attorney. His name is Frank Calloway. He has already been in contact with Adult Protective Services and with a detective at LAPD. Everything we collect will be done with my explicit consent as the owner of this home, which under California law makes it entirely admissible." Sophia looked up from the instruction sheet. Her hands had stopped trembling. In their place was something steadier, a resolution that settled into her posture, like ballast, into the hold of a ship. "If I do this," she said carefully, "and if what I have heard them say is recorded, what happens to them?" "They go to prison," I said, "for a considerable time." She held my gaze for a long moment, and I could see her working through it, the implications, the risk, the weight of committing herself fully to something she had been circling around for weeks. Then she nodded once with the decisive brevity of someone who has made up their mind and does not intend to revisit the decision. "Tell me exactly where it needs to go," she said. I told her. She listened without taking notes, which told me she had a good memory, and then she took the device and the instruction sheet and walked down the hallway toward the stairs, with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything else in that house. I stood in the kitchen and listened to her footsteps on the stairs, and then the soft sounds of the guest room, Ryan and Melissa's room above me, and then her footsteps coming back down. She appeared in the kitchen doorway and handed me the empty instruction sheet, which she had folded into a precise square. "It's done," she said. I picked up my phone and called Frank. He answered on the second ring. "It's placed," I said. "Good," Frank said. "Now we wait." I looked at Sophia across the kitchen counter, this woman who had walked into my house as a stranger playing a part, and had just in the space of 20 minutes become something considerably more important than that. Her eyes were still bright with the adrenaline of it, her chin lifted, her shoulders squared against whatever was coming. "Thank you," I said. Sophia picked up her dish towel from the floor where it had fallen, folded it with automatic neatness, and set it on the counter. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "those people upstairs are planning to take everything your wife helped you build." Her voice was very quiet and very certain. "I have been listening to them talk about it for 3 months. It is my very great pleasure to help stop them." Outside on Oak Hollow Lane, a car turned the corner, and its headlights swept briefly across the kitchen window. Not Ryan and Melissa's car, just a neighbor coming home from somewhere ordinary. But for a half second, both of us went very still, and I felt my heart slam against my ribs with a force that surprised me, and Sophia's hand tightened on the dish towel until her knuckles went pale. Then the car passed, and the kitchen settled back into its quiet, and I exhaled. "I think," I said, "that we should both have some coffee." Sophia let out a breath that was almost a laugh, shaky and relieved, and more honest than anything I had heard in that house in months. "Yes," she said. "I think we should." August in Pasadena arrives like an argument you cannot win. The heat comes in off the San Gabriel Mountains and settles over the city with the particular stubbornness of something that has been doing this for 10,000 years and sees no reason to stop. By 8 in the morning, the air is already thick and bright, and by noon the pepper trees in my garden hang their branches as though even they have given up on the idea of verticality. I have lived here for 34 years, and I have never made my peace with August. Margaret loved it. She would sit on the back porch with her iced tea and her book and say, "Ed, you're the only man in Southern California who acts personally offended by the weather." She was not wrong. I thought about her a great deal that August more than usual, which I had not thought was possible. I think it was because the house had become a place of such concentrated performance. Every meal, every conversation, every ordinary moment, weighted with the knowledge of what was underneath it, and Margaret had always been the person I could be entirely honest with. The absence of that in those particular weeks had a specific texture to it, a specific weight. Sophia and I had developed, without ever discussing it explicitly, a system of communication that required no words and left no evidence, a certain way of setting a dish on the counter, a particular angle of a glance across a room, the kind of shorthand that develops between people who are sharing a secret in close quarters and have learned that the most dangerous thing is not the secret itself, but the moment of transmitting it. The first recordings from the device in Ryan and Melissa's room had been routine conversations about work, about logistics, about a friend's upcoming wedding in San Diego that they had apparently decided not to attend. I had listened to 3 weeks of it with the patience of a man who has learned that most mechanisms reveal their faults on their own schedule, not yours. The earlier recordings had been careful. Melissa conducted most of her substantive conversations after midnight, when she believed the sedative in my evening tea had taken full effect and the house was safely unconscious. It was the one variable she had not accounted for, that I had not been drinking the tea. Then on a Thursday evening in the second week of August, everything changed. I was in the workshop at 11:15 at night, ostensibly finishing the suspension spring on the Seth Thomas clock I had been neglecting for weeks, when my phone buzzed with a file transfer from the small receiver Frank had set up on my end. I put down my tools, I put in my earbuds, I pressed play. Melissa's voice came through first clear and precise, with a particular quality it had when she was being efficient. Clipped consonants, minimal breath between sentences, the voice of a woman running through a checklist. "The arrangement is confirmed for next month," she said. "I spoke with them this afternoon. They have a room ready." A pause. Ryan's voice lower and less certain. "How long does he have to be there before we can move on the house?" 30 days minimum for the legal transfer to process cleanly, Melissa said. 60 to be safe. Wallace says the paperwork will hold. He's done this before. Wallace. I noted the name. Frank would want that. "And the inventory?" Ryan asked. "The Beverly Hills people came back at 2.3, Melissa said, and I heard the satisfaction in her voice, the particular pleasure of someone who has gotten the number they wanted. I told them to hold. We don't move on the inventory until he's been in the arrangement for at least 2 weeks. We don't want it to look rushed." I sat very still on my workshop stool with the earbuds in, and the French mantel clock ticking quietly on the shelf beside me, and I let myself feel for exactly 30 seconds the full force of what I was hearing. My son's voice asking how long before they could move on the house. My son's voice, which I had known since it was a newborn's cry in a delivery room in Huntington Hospital in 1987. Asking that question in that tone, with that casualness, as though the house were a stock option, and I were a liability column in a spreadsheet. 30 seconds. Then I put it away because there was no room for it yet, and kept listening. "What about the transfer document?" Ryan asked. His voice had gone quieter, and I could hear something in it that was not quite reluctance and not quite guilt, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "Wallace said the signature needs to be notarized. How are we going to—" "It's handled," Melissa said, with a finality that closed the subject like a door. "I told you, Wallace has someone. It's not your problem." Another pause, longer this time. "Mel," Ryan said, and the way he said her name short and soft, carrying something he could not quite articulate, made my chest tighten in a way I had not expected. He was not asking a question. He was making a sound, the sound of a man who knows he is somewhere he should not be and cannot find the door out. What if something goes wrong? Nothing is going to go wrong, Melissa said, and her voice had shifted into a register I recognized from the dinner table, warm certain the voice she used when she was reassuring you of something she had already decided was true, regardless of your input. The doctor has done this before. The facility has done this before. Your father is 65 years old, and he lives alone, and his wife just died. Nobody's going to ask difficult questions, Ryan. These things happen to people like him every day. People like him? I took out the earbuds. I set them on the workbench. I sat in the workshop at 11:15 at night, with the August heat pressing against the garage door and the clocks ticking around me, and I let the silence of the room hold me for a moment while I decided what to do with what I was feeling. It was not the fury I had expected. I had been living alongside the anger for 3 months, and it had become in that time something more workmanlike than volcanic, a steady heat rather than an explosion, something I could use rather than something that would use me. What I felt in that moment sitting on my workshop stool with my hands flat on my knees was something closer to grief. Grief for Ryan, who had once sat on this same stool at 10 years old and learned to wind a mainspring, and who had grown into a man who asked questions like the one I had just heard him ask. Grief for whatever had happened between that boy and this moment that I had failed to see clearly enough or early enough to prevent. I picked up my phone and called Frank. He answered on the third ring, which meant I had woken him, which I registered and immediately set aside as something to apologize for later. Ed, he said, alert despite the hour in the way of a man who has learned over decades that late-night calls from clients are rarely good news. Talk to me. I'm sending you a file, I said. Right now while we're on the phone, I need you to listen to it tonight. I heard him sitting up, the rustle of sheets, the click of a bedside lamp. How bad? They confirmed the facility, I said. They talked about the signature. There's someone named Wallace who's handling a forged notarization. They discussed the collection. I paused. Frank, they used the code words, all of them. The arrangement, the inventory, the transfer. You have the key. Cross-reference it tonight. The meaning will be clear. And send it, Frank said. I'll have Reyes listening by morning. I sent the file. I heard Frank's phone chime as it arrived. There's a name, I said. Wallace. He's the one handling the document forgery. They didn't give a last name. We'll find him, Frank said, and the certainty in his voice was the kind that comes from 30 years of knowing how to find things. Ed, this is good. This is very good. We're close. I know, I said. How are you holding up? The question caught me off guard, which it should not have. Frank had been asking me some version of that question for 30 years. And I had been deflecting it for approximately as long. But at 11:20 on a Thursday night in August, sitting in the workshop where Margaret's clocks ticked around me in the dark, the deflection did not come as quickly as usual. I'm all right, I said, and then because Frank Calloway had known me for 3 decades and would not be fooled by the short answer, I added, I heard my son's voice tonight asking how long before he could sell my house. I'm going to need a day or 2 with that. Frank was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost its attorney's precision and become something older and simpler. I know, he said. I'm sorry, Ed. I genuinely am. Don't be sorry yet, I said. Be sorry after. After what? After we've finished it, I said. Then you can be sorry for as long as you like. Frank made a sound that in anyone else I would have called a laugh rueful and tired and more honest than his professional register usually allowed. Get some sleep, he said. We're almost there. I hung up and sat in the workshop for another hour, not working, just listening to the clocks. 347 of them, ticking in their various rhythms, none of them quite synchronized, all of them, keeping time in their own way. Margaret had found that maddening. I had always found it comforting, the idea that things could each keep their own time and still collectively tell the truth about the hour. I looked at the French mantel clock from 1887 with its cracked base and its steady tick. We're almost there. I told it the way I had taken to telling Margaret things when the words needed somewhere to go. The clock ticked back. It did not offer an opinion, but it kept perfect time, which was in the end all I had ever asked of it. There is a specific kind of September evening in Southern California that I have never been able to adequately describe to people who have not lived here, when the heat finally breaks around sundown and the air comes through the windows carrying eucalyptus and dry grass and something else underneath it. Something ancient and clean, like the land itself, exhaling after a long day. That was the kind of evening it was when everything finally began to move. I had known it was coming. Frank had called the morning brief professional, the kind of call that carries its full weight in very few words. "Reyes says they're ready," he said, "whenever the last piece falls." I had thanked him and hung up and spent the rest of the day in the workshop, not working, just keeping my hands busy with small tasks, while my mind ran through everything, one final time, checking each piece the way I check a movement. Before I closed the case, making sure nothing was loose, nothing was out of alignment, nothing would catch at the wrong moment. At 6 o'clock, Ryan came downstairs in a new shirt I had not seen before. Pale blue, well-pressed, the kind of shirt a man wears when he wants to look like he is not thinking about anything in particular. His hands, when he reached past me to take his jacket from the hook by the door, were not entirely steady. I watched his fingers fumble with the collar button for a moment before he got it, and I felt something pull tight behind my sternum. Not anger, not pity, something, with no clean name that lived between them. "Big plans tonight?" I asked, keeping my voice easy. "Company thing," Ryan said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Melissa's already in the car." Through the front window, I could see Melissa in the passenger seat of the Audi, her profile turned away, her phone in her hand. She had been unusually quiet at dinner, which was its own kind of signal. Melissa's silences were never empty. They were calculated, managed, the silences of someone running final calculations. Then she came inside. I had not expected that. She came through the front door with her heels clicking against the entryway tile, already carrying her clutch, already dressed and ready. And she crossed directly to the kitchen, where I was standing with my evening coffee, and she smiled at me with the full warmth of her considerable talent for smiling, and she set a cup and saucer on the counter in front of me. "I made you some tea before we go," she said, and her voice was so genuinely warm that for a half second, even knowing everything I knew, even having listened to her voice on a recording, say, "These things happen to people like him every day," something in me flinched at the performance of it, not because I believed it, because it was so good. "The chamomile blend from Trader Joe's. You said it helped you sleep." She pushed the cup gently toward me. The steam rose from it in a thin, straight line in the still kitchen air. "Thank you, Melissa," I said. "That's very thoughtful." She squeezed my arm once, brief warm, and then her heels were clicking back across the entryway tile, and the front door closed, and the Audi's engine turned over in the driveway, and I stood in my kitchen with a cup of chamomile tea in front of me and listened to the sound of the car pulling away down Oak Hollow Lane until I could not hear it anymore. Then Sophia came out of the hallway. She had been there the whole time. I had known that, had felt her stillness, in the way you feel the presence of another person in a quiet house. She walked to the kitchen counter without hurrying, picked up the teacup with both hands, carried it to the sink, and poured it out in a single steady stream. She turned on the tap and rinsed the cup and set it upside down on the drying rack. Then she turned to face me, and for the first time in 5 months, she spoke in English. Clear, unaccented, entirely fluent English. "Don't drink anything they leave for you," she said. "You need to get out of this house. You are in danger." I looked at her for a moment. Then I smiled. "I've known you understood English since your first few days here," I said. The color left her face so completely that I was briefly concerned she might need to sit down. She smiled when she put it down. Sophia said, her voice not quite steady now, for an entirely different reason. She smiled like she was giving you a gift. "She's very good at it," I said. "Sit down, Sophia. We have a great deal to talk about." "It makes me sick," Sophia said, and she pressed the back of her hand briefly against her mouth, a gesture so unguarded that it caught me off guard entirely. Her eyes were bright and too full, and she was working very hard to keep her voice level. "Mr. Brooks, I have watched her do this for 5 months, every night with the tea, every morning with the pills, smiling like that every single time, like she stopped, took a breath. "I am sorry, this is not helpful." "It is actually," I said. "Come and sit down." She sat at the kitchen island, and I sat across from her, and the September evening came through the window screen smelling of eucalyptus, and for a moment we simply existed in the same space without the weight of the performance that usually filled every room in that house. "Tomorrow," I said, "Frank says they're ready. Reyes is in place. All that's left is the last step." Sophia looked at me steadily. The brightness in her eyes had not gone away, but it had organized itself into something more purposeful. "You think they'll do it tomorrow?" "I think Melissa has been building to tomorrow for 6 months, I said. "She confirmed the facility last month. The paperwork is ready. They've been watching me get progressively more. I paused, choosing the word carefully, convincing. She'll want to move while she still believes she has the advantage. Sophia was quiet for a moment, her hands wrapped around a glass of water she had poured herself. Then she said, "Are you afraid?" The question surprised me, not because it was unreasonable, it was entirely reasonable, but because no one had asked me that since Frank's late-night call in May, and I had not given myself much room to examine the answer. "Yes," I said, because it was true, and she deserved the truth. Not of them. I looked at my hands on the counter, the hands that had built this house, that had wound 1,000 clockwork mechanisms back to life, that had held Margaret's hand at the end. Of how much of this I caused by not seeing it sooner, by trusting the wrong things for too long. Sophia set her glass down. She looked at me with the direct, clear attention she gave everything, and she said, "You saw it. You just needed time to be sure." A pause. Margaret would have been sure faster, I think. I looked at her. "You never met Margaret?" "No," she said, "but I have been living in her house for 5 months. I know her through her things, the way she organized the kitchen, the labels she put on the shelves in the pantry." She glanced toward the pantry door. She was very sure of herself, I think. "She was," I said. And then, because the evening was that kind of evening, and the year had been that kind of year, I laughed a real one, short and genuine, the first one in longer than I could remember. She absolutely was. Sophia smiled, and it changed her whole face. Outside, the last of the September light was fading over Oak Hollow Lane, and somewhere down the street, a neighbor's dog was barking at something in the middle distance, and the pepper trees in the garden moved very slightly in a breeze that had not been there a moment before. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow, we finish it. What happened in the next 60 seconds changed everything I thought I understood about my own house. Before I tell you, comment I'm here, so I know you made it this far with me. A note before we continue: portions of this story include fictional elements shaped to carry a message worth hearing. If you'd prefer something different, this is a good place to stop. For everyone staying, hold on tight. After Ryan and Melissa's taillights disappeared around the corner, the house settled into the particular quiet of a place that has been holding its breath for a very long time. Sophia was still standing at the sink. She had her back to me, both hands gripping the counter's edge, and I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way they were pulled up and in the posture of someone carrying more weight than they have been letting on. Sophia sat at the kitchen counter with both hands flat on the surface, still processing what had just happened. The adrenaline of the last 60 seconds. The tea. The English, my smile, my words had not yet finished moving through her. "How long?" she asked. Her voice was steadier now, but only just. "How long have you known?" "Since approximately your 3rd day," I said. "The newspaper. You were reading it when you thought I wasn't looking." I paused. "Also, you laughed at Ryan's joke before you caught yourself. And you turned toward sound before it registers visually, which is what people do when they understand a language well enough to anticipate rather than react." She pressed her hand flat against the counter. "I am not a spy," she said, and the words came out with a force that surprised me. "I was not hired to watch you. I needed work, and I was afraid that if employers knew I spoke English, they would—" She stopped. "It is complicated." "It usually is," I said. "But Sophia, I need you to hear what I'm about to tell you, because what happens in this house tomorrow depends on both of us." "Most of it," I said. "Not all." She pressed her lips together so hard they went white at the edges. Then she pulled out the kitchen stool and sat down heavily, like her legs had simply decided they were done being useful. "How long?" "I found the first pill in April," I said. "I've known about the facility since July. Frank had been decoding earlier recordings since June, enough to confirm the shape of it. August was when we got the final piece, the one that named the facility directly and gave us the dollar amount." I paused. "I've been waiting for them to make the final move." Sophia stared at me. Then she put both hands flat on the counter and dropped her head between them and let out a long, shaking breath that was somewhere between a laugh and something considerably less composed. When she looked up, her eyes were wet at the corners. "You knew," she said again, and this time her voice cracked on the second word, a clean break that she did not try to hide. "I have been terrified for 3 months, Mr. Brooks. I have been lying awake at night, running through everything I heard them say, trying to figure out how to warn you without getting myself—" She stopped, pressed a hand against her sternum like she was checking that her heart was still where she left it. "And you knew." "I did," I said, "and I owe you an apology for that. You were carrying something you shouldn't have had to carry alone." She wiped the corner of one eye with the back of her hand, quickly and patiently, the gesture of someone who is annoyed at themselves for the display. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" "Because I needed to know I could trust you completely before I did," I said. "Not because I doubted your character, because I couldn't afford a mistake, and real trust takes time to verify, even in a good mechanism." Sophia looked at me for a long moment, and I could see her deciding how she felt about that answer. Then she exhaled through her nose and said, "That is either the most reasonable thing I have ever heard or the most stubborn." "My wife would have said both," I said. Something shifted in her face, the last of the tension going out of it, replaced by something exhausted and almost fond. "Tell me what you know," she said. "All of it. I want to hear it from you." So I told her. I told her about the pill in April, the call to Dr. Walsh, the APS report, Frank Detective Reyes. I told her about the recordings and Wallace and the forged notarization and the $45,000 deposit to Sunrise Recovery Center. I told her about Frank's strategy wait for the 911 call because that was the piece that made everything else unambiguous and unretractable. She listened without interrupting, her hands folded on the counter, her eyes on my face the whole time. When I finished, the kitchen was very quiet, except for the refrigerator's hum and the distant sound of someone's television 2 houses down on Oak Hollow Lane. "Tomorrow," Sophia said. "Almost certainly," I said. Melissa confirmed the room at the facility. "The paperwork is ready. She'll want to move quickly before anything changes." Sophia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When the police come, I will need to tell them everything. What I heard, what I saw, all of it." "Yes," I said. "Frank has already spoken with Reyes about your statement. Your visa status is not in question. Your H-2B is current and your testimony is fully protected under California law." She nodded, absorbing that. "And after, I said, you will have done something that very few people have the courage to do. The rest takes care of itself." Sophia looked down at her folded hands. One thumb was pressed hard against the base of the other, a small, unconscious pressure that told me she was still working through the fear, even as she was deciding to walk through it. "Mr. Brooks," she said quietly, "I am glad I was here." "So am I," I said, and meant it more than I had meant most things in recent memory. Somewhere in the house, one of the clocks I kept in the hallway chimed the hour, a single clear note that hung in the kitchen air and then dissolved. Tomorrow, I thought. We are ready. I have fixed clocks that other people gave up on, mechanisms everyone said were too far gone, too damaged, too broken to be worth the time. I always believed that if you understood precisely what had failed, you could find a way back. My son taught me that some things break from the inside in ways that no tool can reach. I woke at 5:30 as I always do, and lay in the dark for a few minutes, listening to the house. Above me in the room that had been Margaret's sewing room, I could hear nothing. Ryan and Melissa had come home late. I had heard the Audi in the driveway sometime after midnight, the careful closing of doors that people do when they are trying not to wake someone they are planning to harm in the morning. I got up, made coffee, sat in my chair in the kitchen, with the Los Angeles Times folded in my lap, unread, and waited. Ryan came down at 6:12. He was wearing the clothes he had slept in, gray t-shirt, sweatpants, the particular dishevelment of a man who had not slept much and had stopped caring what that looked like. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment when he saw me, and something moved across his face that he did not manage to control in time. Not guilt exactly, something rawer than guilt. The expression of a man who is standing at the edge of something and has just realized too late how far down it goes. "Morning," he said, his voice rough. "Good morning," I said. "Coffee's fresh." He poured himself a cup and stood at the counter with his back half turned to me, looking out the window at the garden. The pepper trees were still in the early air. A mockingbird was working through its repertoire somewhere in the neighbor's yard, cycling through a dozen stolen songs with the cheerful persistence of a creature that has never once doubted itself. Ryan's hands were wrapped around his mug so tightly that his knuckles had gone pale. I looked at my son, at the back of his neck, at the set of his shoulders, at the way he was holding himself together, with what I could see was a considerable and failing effort, and I felt the grief of it move through me like a current. This was my boy. This was the 10-year-old who had sat on the workshop stool and held a mainspring with the focused intensity of someone who desperately wanted to get it right. I had watched him grow from that child, into this man, and somewhere in that distance, something had gone terribly wrong, and I had not caught it in time, and that failure belonged to me as much as anything else. Ryan set his mug down. He picked up his phone from the counter. He looked at it for a long moment, his thumb hovering over the screen, and I could see him building towards something. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened, and his breath went shallow, and his thumb moved fractionally toward Melissa's name. My heart hammered so hard I was certain he could hear it. Then his phone lit up in his hand. Melissa's name on the screen. He answered it before the second ring. "I know," he said immediately before she could speak, and his voice broke open on those two words in a way that told me exactly how close he had just come. "I know. I'm ready." Melissa's voice came through the phone. I could not hear the words, only the tone, which was low and smooth and absolutely certain, the voice of someone who has already closed a door and is now standing in front of it to make sure it stays shut. Ryan's shoulders dropped, not in relief. In the particular collapse of a person who has just put down something they were almost strong enough to carry. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Okay." He hung up. He stood at the counter for another moment, not moving his hand flat on the tile surface like he needed the solidity of it. Then he turned around and I was looking at my newspaper, and he looked at me, and I looked up at him with the mild, unhurried expression of a man with nothing on his mind but the crossword. "You okay, son?" I asked. Ryan's face did something complicated and painful that lasted less than a second before he got it back under control. "Fine," he said. "Just tired." "Long night?" I said. "Yeah," he said. "Long night." He took his coffee and went back upstairs, and I listened to his footsteps on the stairs, heavier going up than they had been coming down, and I set the newspaper on the table and looked out at the pepper trees in the early September light. One more day, I told them, or told myself, or told Margaret, depending on how you count. One more day. Melissa had a gift for performance that I had underestimated for too long, and that afternoon watching her work, I found myself thinking that, under different circumstances, she might have been genuinely formidable. She came downstairs at 2 o'clock in a cashmere sweater, the color of old cream, her hair down her manner, soft and unhurried, the whole presentation calibrated to read as a daughter-in-law spending a quiet afternoon with her father-in-law. She brought a plate of sliced apples to the living room, where I was sitting with a book I had not been reading, set it on the side table next to me, and sat down in the armchair across from mine with a cup of tea and the particular ease of someone who has decided they have all the time in the world. I knew what this was. A final assessment. One last look at the subject before tomorrow. "How are you feeling today, Edward?" She asked, her voice warm, with what I had learned to recognize as engineered concern, the kind that is indistinguishable from the real thing until you know what you are looking for. "A little foggy," I said, letting my eyes drift slightly before refocusing. "Didn't sleep well." Melissa nodded with exactly the right amount of sympathy. "You've seemed more tired lately. Ryan and I have both noticed." "Have you?" I said, as though this were new information. "I suppose I have been a bit." I paused, looked at the bookshelf, looked back at her. What were we talking about? Something moved behind her eyes. Satisfaction quick and bright, gone before it fully arrived. "Just saying you seem tired, Ed." "Right," I said. "Yes, I suppose I am." She let that settle for a moment, then said very gently, "I was thinking about your savings account, the one at Wells Fargo. I wanted to make sure we had the right information in case anything ever—" She stopped herself with precisely calibrated hesitation. "I just want to make sure we can take care of things, if you ever needed us to step in." I looked at her with the slightly unfocused expression I had been practicing for 3 months. "The Wells Fargo one," I repeated slowly as though pulling it from somewhere far away. "Margaret handled most of that. I'm not entirely sure there's a number somewhere, a pin or—" I shook my head. "I'd have to look." "Of course," Melissa said warmly. "No rush at all." She wrote something in her phone with the casual speed of someone making a note, and I watched her do it and felt the cold clarity of knowing exactly what the note said and felt nothing about it except a quiet, purposeful readiness. 30 minutes later, she excused herself to make a phone call. She went to the back hallway, but the house on Oak Hollow Lane was not built for privacy. I had designed it for a family that talked to each other, which meant the acoustics were generous, and I could hear her voice from the living room without trying. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "We'll call from the house. Ryan will make the call." A pause. He's exactly as we expected. No better, actually. Another pause, and her voice dropped slightly, but not enough. The inventory. Yes, I have a contact at the Beverly Hills location, ready to move within 72 hours of the transfer. I reached over and picked up a slice of apple from the plate she had brought me, and I ate it, and I looked at the French mantel clock on the bookshelf, the 1887 piece with the cracked base Margaret's clock, the one I would never repair. And I felt something in my chest settle into place with the clean precision of a gear finding its tooth. Sophia appeared in the doorway from the kitchen, a dishcloth in her hands, her eyes finding mine across the room, with the steady certainty of someone who had heard everything and needed me to know it. I gave her the smallest possible nod. She disappeared back into the kitchen. Melissa returned from the hallway, smoothing her sweater, her expression arranged back into the warm, unhurried afternoon version of herself. "Sorry about that," she said, sitting back down. "Work." "No trouble," I said pleasantly. She picked up her tea. I picked up my book. The September afternoon light came through the front windows and fell across the floor in long gold rectangles, and the house was very quiet. And somewhere in the workshop, the clocks ticked on without interruption, keeping the time we were all running out of each in our own way. "Big day tomorrow," Melissa said, not looking up from her phone. She meant it one way. I heard it another. "Yes," I said, "I imagine it will be. I have always done my best thinking in the workshop. There is something about being surrounded by mechanisms that are in various states of coming apart and being put back together that clarifies the mind in a way that nothing else quite manages. Every clock on those shelves represents a problem that was solved, a gear that was recut, a spring that was replaced, a pivot that was polished back to life. Proof arranged in rows that broken things can be made whole again if you understand them well enough and are patient enough and care enough to do the work properly. I went out there at 9 o'clock after Ryan and Melissa's light went out upstairs, and I did not turn on the overhead fluorescence. Just the small lamp on the workbench, the one with the warm amber bulb that Margaret had picked out, because she said the white light made the workshop feel like a hospital. I had kept that bulb for 14 months. I intended to keep it considerably longer. I sat on my stool, and I did not pick up any tools. Instead, I looked at the clocks, 347 of them, in the amber light, ticking in their various rhythms. The deep, authoritative tick of the Vienna regulator, the quick, bright pulse of a small carriage clock near the window, the steady, unhurried beat of the French mantelpiece from 1887 on the shelf directly in front of me, its cracked base catching the light, the way it always did, turning the imperfection into something that looked almost intentional. "Well, Margaret," I said to the empty workshop, "tomorrow's the day." I had developed the habit of talking to her out there, sometime in the weeks after the funeral, when the silence of the house had become genuinely unbearable, and I had found that saying things out loud to the clocks she had loved was the closest I could get to saying them to her. It was not, I want to be clear, something I believed in literally. I did not think Margaret could hear me. I thought that saying things out loud forces you to mean them in a way that thinking them does not, and that the workshop full of her choices and her taste and the particular arrangement of things she had helped me decide on was the right place to mean things. "I should have seen Ryan sooner," I said. "I want you to know I understand that. Something was going wrong with him long before Melissa and I was busy with other things, and I told myself he was fine because it was easier than the alternative." The carriage clock ticked brightly in the corner. "That one's on me." I reached out and picked up the 1887 French mantel clock. It was heavier than it looked, as good things often are. I turned it in my hands, feeling the familiar weight of it, the slight roughness of the case where the gilding had worn away in the places Margaret had touched it most often. She had found it at an estate sale in San Marino on a Saturday morning in October of 2019, 4 years before she died, and she had called me from the sale while I was home drinking coffee and said, "Ed, I found a clock. Don't be difficult about it." I had said I was never difficult. She had laughed so hard, she had to put the phone down for a moment. I ran my thumb along the crack in the base. She had been right not to let me repair it. The crack was part of the object's history, now evidence of a life lived of being carried and set down, and moved from place to place by hands that cared about it. Repairing it would have been a kind of erasure. Some imperfections Margaret had understood instinctively are not flaws, they are records. I set the clock back on the shelf. "I'm going to be all right," I told her. "After tomorrow, I mean. I know it won't look the way I thought it would, Ryan in prison, the house quieter than ever." My voice caught slightly on that, a small involuntary hitch that I did not try to smooth over. But I'm going to be all right. Sophia is here. Frank is ready. Reyes knows what to do. I looked at the crack in the base of the clock. You would have liked Sophia, I think. She's very sure of herself. Reminds me of someone. The workshop ticked around me, all those mechanisms keeping their various times, none of them synchronized, all of them true. I turned off the amber lamp. I walked back through the dark garden, past the pepper trees that Margaret had helped me plant in 1994, up the back steps and into the kitchen, where the nightlight over the stove threw a small, warm circle on the floor. I checked the front door locked, the back door locked, the windows latched. Then I climbed the stairs, past the closed door of Ryan and Melissa's room. Without pausing, went into my bedroom and lay down on my side of the bed, which had been my side for 32 years. And which I had never once been tempted to move to the center of, because the space on Margaret's side felt like something that belonged to her still, and I was not ready to claim it. I closed my eyes. For the first time since she died, the house felt quiet in the right way, not empty, but settled. I was ready for morning. The alarm went off at 5:30. I lay there for exactly 1 minute, feeling the particular quality of a day that is going to matter, the way the September light was already coming through the curtains, the neighbors' sprinklers running on their usual schedule, the smell of Pasadena drifting through the window, screen dry and faintly floral and entirely ordinary. Then I got up, showered, dressed in the clothes I always wore, khaki trousers, a blue button-down, the brown leather belt Margaret had given me for my 58th birthday that I had worn so often it had gone soft as cloth. I was not going to change anything about myself for this day. That felt important. I went downstairs and made coffee. The kitchen was empty, the house still, the early light coming through the window above the sink in a long, pale rectangle that fell across the floor tiles and moved very slowly, the way light does when you're paying attention to it. I stood at the counter and drank my first cup, standing up, which I always do, and listened to the house breathe around me. At 6:50, I heard Sophia moving in her room, off the back hallway, the quiet sounds of a person getting ready with deliberate care. A drawer opening and closing, water running briefly. Her door opened and shut with the particular softness of someone who understands that the sounds a house makes in the morning are a kind of language. She appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6:55, dressed and composed, and looked at me across the kitchen with an expression that carried everything we did not need to say out loud. The acknowledgement of what today was, the steadiness she had decided to bring to it, the faint brightness behind her eyes, that was not quite fear and not quite excitement, but something that lived between them, the feeling of standing at the edge of something that cannot be undone. "Coffee," I said. "Please," she said. I poured her a cup, and she stood at the counter across from me, and we drank in the early morning quiet of the kitchen, and the light moved on the floor tiles, and the clocks in the workshop ticked through the garage wall, and it was for those few minutes almost peaceful. Then the ceiling creaked. Ryan and Melissa were up. Sophia set her cup down and straightened slightly her chin, lifting by a fraction, her shoulders squaring, in the way I had come to recognize as her version of armoring up. I took my coffee to my armchair in the living room, picked up the Los Angeles Times from where it had landed on the porch, and opened it to the crossword page. I had a pen in my shirt pocket. I took it out and held it, and looked at the clues and did not fill in a single answer, and waited. Ryan came downstairs first at 7:15. He was wearing a collared shirt and dark slacks on a Saturday morning, which was the tell Ryan lived in t-shirts on weekends had since college, and the sight of him in pressed clothes before 8 on a Saturday hit me somewhere below the sternum with a dull, specific ache. He was performing normalcy the way all of us were, but his version of it was slightly too formal, slightly too careful, like a man who is dressed for a job interview and is trying to look like he does this every day. "A morning, Dad," he said, and his voice was steady. I gave him credit for that. "Good morning," I said. "Sleep well?" "Sure," he said, a beat too fast. "Yeah, fine." He went to the kitchen, and I heard him and Sophia exchanging the minimal sounds of two people navigating a small space. The coffee machine, the refrigerator, the brief percussion of a cabinet opening and closing. Sophia's voice soft and accented offering something, Ryan's voice declining it, neither of them prolonging the contact. Melissa came down at 7:32. She was dressed as if for a business meeting, tailored blazer, dark trousers, heels, that clicked against each stair with the measured precision of someone who has decided what kind of morning this is going to be. Her hair was done. Her makeup was done. She looked in the vocabulary of her particular performance exactly like a devoted daughter-in-law managing a difficult family situation with grace and competence. She looked at me in my armchair with my newspaper, and she smiled and said, "Good morning, Edward. How are we feeling today?" "A little confused," I said pleasantly. "I keep thinking it's a weekday." "It's Saturday, sweetheart," she said, and the endearment landed like something dropped from a height. She had never called me that before. The escalation of intimacy told me everything about where we were in her timeline. She went to the kitchen. I heard her voice low and quick, saying something to Ryan that I could not make out. Ryan's response shorter, the sound of Melissa opening the pill organizer on the kitchen counter, the small plastic click of the Saturday compartment. She came into the living room with the pill and a glass of water, set both on the side table next to my chair, and rested her hand briefly on my shoulder. "Don't forget your medication, Ed," she said. "It's important." "Thank you," I said. "You're so thoughtful." She went back to the kitchen. I looked at the pill, the wrong color as it had been for 5 months, the slightly too smooth texture, the careful counterfeit of something that was supposed to keep me alive. I picked it up, held it between my thumb and forefinger, put it in my mouth. Sophia came through the living room at that moment with a folded dishcloth over her arm, moving toward the hallway in the unhurried way of someone doing ordinary morning tasks. As she passed my chair, she adjusted the dishcloth over her arm, and I turned my head slightly toward her, and the pill left my mouth and was inside the folded cloth in a motion so small and so practiced that it occupied perhaps half a second of time. Sophia continued down the hallway without altering her pace by a single step. I picked up my water glass, took a long drink, and set it back down. "All taken care of," I called toward the kitchen. "Good," Melissa called back, warm and bright. I looked down at the crossword, one across a timepiece that is always right twice a day. I filled in the answer, clock, and set my pen down on the newspaper, and looked out the front window at Oak Hollow Lane in the September morning light, at the pepper trees and the ordinary street and the completely ordinary world that was about to change in ways that could not be predicted and could not be taken back. In the kitchen, Ryan's phone buzzed on the counter. I heard him pick it up. I heard the brief sound of a text notification, and then silence. And then the sound of Ryan setting the phone back down very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands are not entirely under your control. My heart beat steadily. My hands were still. I was ready. It happened at 9 o'clock exactly. I know because I was looking at the mantel clock in the living room when Melissa came out of the kitchen and stood in the doorway and looked at Ryan with an expression I was not supposed to see. Quick, decisive, a single nod, so small it might have been a muscle twitch. But it was not a muscle twitch. It was a starting gun. Ryan stood up from the kitchen table. I heard his chair scrape back. I heard his footsteps cross the kitchen floor, the same footsteps I had known for 38 years, that I had listened to on Christmas mornings and school day mornings, and the morning he came home from college for the last time with everything he owned in the back of a rented pickup truck, and stood in the driveway looking at the house like he was trying to memorize it. I heard those footsteps go into the hallway, and I heard him stop, and I heard him take one breath that was audible all the way from the living room, and then I heard him dial. 911, what is your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was flat and professional, through the phone speaker carrying into the hallway, with the particular clarity of a quiet house on a still morning. Ryan's voice, when it came, was not as steady as he had probably hoped. It cracked on the first word, and he had to pull it back together before he could continue. My father just collapsed. He's unconscious. I need an ambulance." He gave the address the address of the house I had built the street where I had lived for 30 years, in a voice that shook badly enough that the dispatcher asked him to repeat it. "Oak Hollow Lane," Ryan said again, and his voice broke open on the name of the street, the way a man's voice breaks when he has finally done the thing he cannot take back, and his body knows it, even if his mind is still pretending otherwise. "Pasadena, please hurry." I sat in my armchair with the Los Angeles Times on my knee. I did not move. I did not look toward the hallway. I looked at the crossword page at the answer I had filled in, clock, and I breathed evenly in and out the way Margaret had taught me to breathe when something was very hard and I needed to stay present for it. In the kitchen doorway, Melissa had her phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was very low and very quick. I caught fragments, "He's down," and "just like we discussed," and I filed them because Frank would want to know, and because the recording device upstairs was capturing everything anyway. Sophia appeared from the back hallway with a dishcloth in her hands and looked at me with eyes that were very bright and very scared and very brave. All at the same time, three things that I had not previously thought could coexist in a single expression, but which I was discovering could. I looked at her, and I shook my head once very slightly steady, and she pressed her lips together and lifted her chin and nodded back. Ryan came back into the living room. He stopped in the entrance to the room and looked at me sitting in my chair, newspaper, on my knee, coffee on the side table, pen in my hand. And the expression that crossed his face was not something I had a precise word for, and am not sure language has one. It was the expression of a man who has just done something he knew was wrong, and has walked into the room and found the evidence of it sitting upright in an armchair looking at him. His face went the color of old paper. His hand came up and gripped the doorframe, and I could see his knuckles whiten and his jaw work as he tried to find something to say, and could not locate it anywhere. I looked at my son. "Everything all right?" I asked. My voice was perfectly, completely ordinary. Ryan's mouth opened. What came out was barely a sound. "Dad, the coffee's still warm," I said. "If you'd like some." His hand tightened on the doorframe until I thought he might pull it loose from the wall. His eyes were glassy and too bright, and he was breathing in the shallow, rapid way of someone whose body has understood something that his mind is still refusing to process. Melissa appeared behind him, her hand finding his arm, her voice low and urgent in his ear. I could not hear the words. I did not need to. I knew what they were. Ryan let go of the doorframe. He straightened. He looked at me one more time with that expression I have no word for, and then he looked away. Somewhere on Oak Hollow Lane in the middle distance, a siren started up. It was coming this way. The ambulance pulled into the driveway at 9:08. I know the exact time because I was looking at the clock on the wall when the red and white light swept across the living room ceiling, the same ceiling I had plastered myself in the summer of 1990. On a ladder for 3 weeks, Margaret handing me tools from below and telling me I had missed a spot. Melissa was at the front door before the paramedics had finished parking. I heard her voice shift into a register I had not heard from her before. Higher, ragged at the edges, threaded through with precisely calibrated panic. She was good. She was, I will give her that, genuinely very good. "Please hurry," she was saying as she pulled the door open. He was on the floor, and then he wasn't moving, and I don't know how long he was. Please, he's in the living room. 2 paramedics came through the door with a gurney between them, moving with the efficient urgency of people who do this every day, and have stopped being surprised by most of it. The first one was a broad-shouldered man in his 30s with a dark beard and a tablet already in his hand. The second was a younger woman with her hair pulled back and a stethoscope around her neck. They came around the corner into the living room and stopped. I was sitting in my armchair. I had the Los Angeles Times folded open to the crossword page. I had my pen in my right hand. I had my coffee cup in my left. I looked up at them with the mild, unhurried expression of a man interrupted in the middle of a quiet morning, and I said, "Good morning. I'm sorry about the confusion." The paramedic with the beard looked at me. He looked at the gurney he was holding. He looked back at me. Something moved across his face that, in another circumstance, might have been almost funny. The specific recalibration of a person whose entire expectation of a situation has just been revised in under 3 seconds. "Sir," he said carefully, "are you Edward Brooks?" "I am," I said. "Are you—" He glanced at Melissa, who had come in behind them and was standing in the entrance to the living room, with her hand pressed flat against her sternum, her face rearranging itself rapidly through several expressions, before settling on confused distress. "We received a call that you had lost consciousness. I've been in this chair since 7 o'clock, I said. "Ask Sophia." Sophia stepped out of the kitchen doorway. She was composed and straight-spined, and when she spoke it was in clear, unaccented English that filled the room like something that had been waiting a long time to be let out. "Mr. Brooks has been in that chair since before 7, she said. "I made his coffee at 6:55. He has not moved from that room." The female paramedic was writing something on her own tablet. The bearded one was looking at Melissa with an expression that had shifted from professional neutrality into something more careful and more watchful. Melissa's hand dropped from her sternum. The color in her face went wrong. Not pale exactly, but uneven, blotchy, the way color goes when the mechanism that manages it has stopped receiving proper instructions. Her eyes moved from the paramedics to Sophia, and in that movement, in the fraction of a second, when she registered that Sophia was standing in her kitchen, speaking fluent English, something happened behind her eyes that I had never seen there before. The performance cracked. Not completely, not yet, but I saw the hairline fracture running through the whole carefully constructed surface of her, the moment when the mechanism that had been running her face for 6 months slipped just slightly off its track. He must have recovered, she said, and her voice had lost its ragged precision and become something flatter and less controlled. He was on the floor. Ryan saw him. Ryan was standing in the kitchen doorway with both hands braced against the frame, and the expression on his face was not one he was managing at all anymore. His eyes were red at the rims. His jaw was working. He looked at the paramedics and opened his mouth, and what came out was, I thought... He stopped. He could not finish the sentence. There was no version of the sentence that finished in a way he could say out loud in this room. The bearded paramedic looked at Ryan. He looked at Melissa. He looked at me in my armchair with my crossword and my coffee, and I could see him assembling the shape of this situation with the practiced efficiency of a man who has walked into a great many rooms and learned to read what they contain. "Sir," he said to me very quietly, "are you all right?" "I'm quite well, thank you," I said. "I apologize for bringing you out here unnecessarily. I imagine you have more important places to be." He looked at me for a moment longer than the question required. Then he reached for his radio. Behind Melissa, through the still-open front door, I could see the September morning on Oak Hollow Lane, the pepper trees, the ordinary street, the completely ordinary world. And coming around the corner of it, unhurried and certain, were 3 vehicles that had nothing to do with emergency medicine. I set my coffee cup down on the side table. I folded my newspaper. I stood up. I've been building toward this moment for 6 months. So have you. Before I tell you what happened when that front door opened a second time, drop "Dad" in the comments. Let me see who made it all the way here. A gentle reminder, some elements of this story are fictional, added with purpose and care. If you'd rather not continue, this is your moment to go. But for everyone staying, we're almost there. Detective Carla Reyes came through my front door first. She was a compact woman in her mid-40s in a dark blazer with close-cropped hair, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have walked into a great many difficult rooms and have stopped needing to announce themselves in them. She had her badge out before she was fully through the door, and her eyes moved across the living room in one clean sweep. The paramedics, the gurney, Melissa, Ryan, Sophia. Me and I could see her cataloging all of it with a speed and precision that reminded me involuntarily of the way a master watchmaker assesses a movement for the first time. Behind her came Frank. Frank Calloway, at 68, was a tall man who had gone silver-haired and sharp-eyed in equal measure, and he was carrying a file folder thick enough to use as a doorstop. And when he came through my front door and looked at me standing in my living room, he did something I had not seen him do in 30 years of friendship. He smiled with his whole face, not the professional version, not the courtroom version, but the real one, the one that meant he was genuinely privately relieved. Behind Frank came Dr. Patricia Walsh, her gray hair short, and her expression the focused calm of someone who has been waiting for this moment and is prepared to conduct herself correctly in it. She carried a manila envelope that contained, I knew, the results of 3 months of chemical analysis. Behind Dr. Walsh came an APS investigator. I had not met a woman in her 50s with a lanyard badge and a canvas briefcase, and behind her, 2 officers in LAPD uniforms who positioned themselves at either side of the doorway with the efficient quietness of people doing a job they know how to do. The living room on Oak Hollow Lane had never felt so small or so consequential. Detective Reyes looked at Melissa. "Melissa Brooks," she said, and her voice was level and clear and carried to every corner of the room without being raised. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit elder abuse, felony poisoning, forgery of legal documents, and false imprisonment under California Penal Code, Sections 368, 470, and 236. Melissa's face did something I had never seen it do. It stopped performing, for one unguarded second, with the detective's words still in the air, and the officers moving toward her. Melissa Brooks's face simply showed what was underneath all of it, and what was underneath was not fury or fear, but something rawer and more terrible than either the expression of someone who has built an entire architecture of control and is watching it come down around them and cannot locate in the rubble of it a single piece that will hold. Then she found her voice. "You cannot do this," she said. and the crack in it was audible to everyone in the room. "He invited us here. We were taking care of him. Ryan, tell them, Ryan." Ryan did not tell them anything. Ryan was standing against the kitchen doorframe, with both arms wrapped around himself, his shoulders curved inward, his face crumpled in the way of a man who has been bracing against something for a very long time and has just been allowed to stop. He was not crying yet, but he was close to it. His eyes were glassy and his breathing was ragged, and he looked in that moment very much like the 10-year-old boy who used to come into the workshop when something had gone wrong at school and sit on the stool and not say anything for a while until he felt better. My chest ached with a grief so specific and so old it had its own address. Frank set his file folder on the coffee table and opened it. 4 months of recorded evidence, he said to the detective and to the room. Chemical analysis of substituted medication documented by Dr. Walsh. Audio recordings made with the homeowner's explicit consent. Correspondence confirming the deposit of $45,000 to Sunrise Recovery Center. And a partially executed power of attorney document bearing a forged signature notarized by a man named Daniel Wallace, who is currently being interviewed by the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. Dr. Walsh opened her manila envelope and handed its contents to the APS investigator without a word. The investigator looked at the documents and nodded once. The officers moved toward Melissa. She stepped backward 1 step involuntary, the body's last argument against what the mind already knows is finished. And then she stopped because there was nowhere to go, and she straightened and she looked at me. I looked back at her. I wanted to say something. I turned it over in my mind for a moment, looking for the right words, and found that there were none that were worth the air they would cost. Some conclusions do not require a spoken sentence. Some things are finished by the simple fact of being seen clearly finally in a room full of people who understand exactly what they are looking at. Then Melissa turned her head and looked at Sophia. And there it was, the moment I had been waiting for, without knowing I was waiting for it. I watched it happen in Melissa's face, the recognition arriving in stages like a mechanism engaging tooth by tooth, each gear catching the next. The woman who had spent 5 months believing she had an advantage in this house. The woman who had planned and calculated and constructed and controlled, and who had built the entire architecture of her plan on a foundation she had never thought to examine. Sophia met her gaze and did not look away, and did not say a single word, and the courage of that, the simple absolute courage of standing still and being looked at by someone who wanted very much for you not to exist, was one of the finest things I had ever witnessed. Melissa made a sound that was not quite a word. Then the officers had her by the arms, and she was moving toward the door, and Ryan was being guided by the second officer with a gentleness that surprised me, and the living room that Margaret and I had designed together in 1989 was full of people doing the difficult necessary work of consequence. Frank came and stood beside me. "Ed," he said quietly. "I know," I said. Outside on Oak Hollow Lane, the morning continued in its ordinary way, entirely indifferent to what had just happened inside the house on the corner, the way mornings do. The officer who had Ryan by the arm was a young man 26-27, with an open, serious face and the careful movements of someone who understood that what he was doing to another person mattered, and wanted to do it with as much dignity as the situation allowed. He paused at the entrance to the living room and looked at me, and something passed between us that did not require words, a question and an answer conducted entirely in the language of two people who understood the same thing at the same time. He stepped back. He gave us the room. Ryan stood in the middle of the living room floor, the floor I had laid myself in, 1991, the same wide plank white oak Margaret had chosen from a catalog, worn smooth now, in the paths we had walked most often. And he looked at me, and everything he'd been holding together for 6 months came apart all at once. He did not collapse. He did not fall. He simply released. His shoulders dropped and his face crumpled, and his eyes filled and spilled over in the way of a man who has been clenching every muscle he possesses against something for so long that when the clenching stops, the relief and the devastation arrive simultaneously and are for a moment indistinguishable from each other. "Dad," he said, and the word came out broken in the middle, split cleanly in two by the weight of everything it was carrying. "Dad, I don't..." He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth hard, as though he could physically hold back what was trying to get out. His whole body was shaking. "I don't know how to... There isn't, Dad. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I know it doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't." "Juan, de propostas. He could not finish. The sentence kept collapsing before it got to the end, falling apart under its own weight, the way structures do when the thing holding them up is finally removed. I looked at my son. I looked at the hands that were pressed against his mouth, long-fingered steady, under normal circumstances, the hands I had watched learn to wind a mainspring at age 10 with the focused intensity of a child who desperately wanted to get something right. Those hands were shaking now. The handcuffs on his wrists caught the morning light, coming through the front window and through a small, bright point across the ceiling. And I watched it move and thought about all the mornings I had stood in this room and not noticed the light doing that. I walked toward him, not quickly, not with any particular ceremony. I simply crossed the floor of my living room the way I had crossed it 10,000 times before, and I stopped in front of my son and I put my hand on his shoulder. He flinched at the touch, a full-body flinch like a man who has forgotten that hands can land on him without meaning harm. Then he went very still, and I felt through my palm the shaking in him that he was trying to control and could not. "Ryan," I said. He looked at me. His eyes were streaming and his face was a wreck, and he was 38 years old, and he looked about 12, which is the age all of our children are when they are in the most trouble regardless of what the calendar says. "I know," I said. 2 words. I had turned them over in my mind for weeks, looking for something better, something more complete, something that could carry the full weight of what I meant. The grief and the love and the fury and the loss and the fact that I understood even now, even here, that he was my son and that would never stop being true regardless of what it cost me. 2 words was what I had. 2 words was what there was. His face crumpled further at that, a fresh wave of it moving through him, his shoulders heaving once, twice before he got it back under control. "I don't deserve," he started. "No," I agreed quietly. "You don't." He flinched again, nodded. The honesty of it seemed to steady him somehow, the way cold water steadies a person, not comfortable, but clarifying. I took my hand off his shoulder. I stepped back. The young officer came forward again gently, and Ryan went with him without resistance, without a word, without looking back, with the particular quality of surrender that is not defeat, but something more like exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who has been fighting the wrong battle for a very long time and has finally, at tremendous cost, stopped. At the door, he paused. He did not turn around. He just stopped for one breath in the frame of the door I had hung myself in, 1991, slightly crooked, that Margaret had never let me fix. And then he went through it, and the morning took him, and he was gone. I stood in the living room alone. My hand was still warm from his shoulder. 3 months later, I sat in courtroom 14 of the Los Angeles County Superior Court on a Tuesday morning in December, and listened to a judge read the sentences aloud and felt for the first time since Margaret died that the world was operating more or less the way it was supposed to. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected. I do not know what I had been imagining, something grander, perhaps something with more ceremony, proportional to the weight of what had happened. What I got was a room with fluorescent lighting and dark wood paneling and rows of seats that were uncomfortable in the particular way of seats that have held a great many people through a great many difficult things and have stopped apologizing for it. Frank sat beside me in his good charcoal suit, the one he wore for closings, his file folder on the table in front of him, untouched. He did not need it anymore. Everything that needed to be proved had been proved. Ryan and Melissa sat at the defense table with their respective attorneys not looking at each other. In the 3 months since September, something had happened to Ryan's face that I could not precisely name. The softness that had lived there when he was uncertain, the look of a man who had not quite finished growing into his own features, was gone. What was left was starker, more defined the face of someone who has made a decision they cannot unmake and has stopped pretending otherwise. He had lost weight. He sat with his hands folded on the table in front of him, and he did not look at Melissa, and he did not look at me, and he looked in the vocabulary of his face like a man serving the first day of whatever came next. Melissa looked exactly as she always had, hair done, posture perfect. The performance so ingrained it apparently continued operating even in a courtroom, even with everything she had built already in pieces around her. I found that in a strange way the most frightening thing about her, not the cruelty or the calculation, but the degree to which the surface had become inseparable from whatever was underneath it. The judge was a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain, and the patient, unhurried demeanor of someone who has heard every possible human story and maintains, despite that, a functional belief in the value of consequences. She read the sentences in a voice that was clear and even and entirely without drama, which seemed right to me. Drama was for the people these sentences were happening to. The court's job was to be steady. Ryan Michael Brooks, guilty plea to conspiracy to commit elder abuse, felony poisoning, and conspiracy to commit fraud. 6 years, California Department of Corrections. Eligible for parole consideration after 4 years, contingent on continued cooperation with the ongoing investigation. Ryan closed his eyes when she read it. 1 second, 2. Then he opened them again and looked at the table in front of him and nodded once as though confirming something to himself. Melissa Ann Brooks. Guilty plea to elder abuse in the first-degree forgery of legal documents, false imprisonment, and wire fraud in connection with the operation of Sunrise Recovery Center. 16 years, California Department of Corrections. Parole eligibility after 12 years. Melissa did not close her eyes. She sat perfectly still and looked at the middle distance somewhere above the judge's head, and her face did not move, and I thought that this was either great courage or its precise opposite, and I was not sure it mattered which. Dr. Gerald Marsh, guilty plea to medical fraud and conspiracy to commit elder abuse. 5 years, California Department of Corrections. Medical license permanently revoked by the California Medical Board, effective immediately. Sunrise Recovery Center. The judge noted had been the subject of a federal investigation conducted by the FBI's Los Angeles field office. 11 additional cases involving similar patterns of fraudulent commitment had been identified across 4 years of operation. The facility had been ordered closed, its assets frozen, and its principals charged under federal wire fraud statutes. When the judge finished, the courtroom did the thing courtrooms do. A collective exhale, a shifting of weight, the sound of people picking up bags and coats, and beginning the process of reassembling themselves for the world outside. Frank leaned toward me. "Ed," he said quietly. "I know," I said. He put his hand briefly on my arm, a touch, as economical and as genuine as the man himself. And then he withdrew it and began gathering his papers with the practiced efficiency of someone who has many more cases after this one and intends to do them all properly. I looked at Ryan one last time across the courtroom. He was standing now, his attorney beside him, the corrections officer, a respectful distance away. He had his hands at his sides uncuffed for the moment, though that would change in the hallway, and he was looking at the floor. And then he was not looking at the floor. He was looking at me, and we looked at each other across the width of courtroom 14 on a Tuesday morning in December, with the fluorescent lights humming overhead and everything that had ever been between us. The good years and the terrible recent ones. The workshop and the mainspring and the 38 years of a relationship that was not what either of us had believed it was, and was also undeniably real, all of it present in the 10 feet of air between us. I nodded. He nodded back. Then the corrections officer touched his elbow, and he turned and walked toward the side door, and I watched him go, and I did not look away until the door had closed behind him, and the room was simply a room again, fluorescent and ordinary and still. Frank stood beside me and waited. Outside, through the tall windows of the courthouse on South Hill Street, the December sky over downtown Los Angeles was the specific pale blue of a California winter afternoon, clear and flat and enormously indifferently wide. "Ready," Frank said. I picked up my coat from the back of the chair. "Yes," I said. "Let's go home." I drove home from the courthouse alone. Frank had offered to ride with me in the way Frank offers things, not pressing, just making it available, leaving the door open without standing in it. I had told him I was fine and that I would call him Thursday, and he had looked at me for a moment with the 30-year gaze of a man who knows when you mean what you say, and then he had nodded and let me go. The drive from downtown Los Angeles to Pasadena on the 210 takes 40 minutes on a good day and considerably longer on a Tuesday afternoon in December when half the city has decided that this is the moment to change lanes without signaling. I did not mind. I had the radio on low, a classical station out of Claremont that Margaret had programmed into the car before she died, and that I had never reprogrammed partly from habit and partly from something less logical. And I drove through the December afternoon with the pale California sky above me and let the city move past the windows at its own pace. I thought about Ryan. I thought about the nod in the courtroom, that small mutual acknowledgement across 10 feet of fluorescent air. I did not know what it meant exactly. I suspected it did not mean forgiveness or reconciliation or any of the larger words that get attached to moments like that. I thought it meant something simpler. I thought it meant, I see you. I know what this is. We are both going to have to live with it. That seemed given everything like enough. I pulled into the driveway on Oak Hollow Lane at 3:47 in the afternoon. Sophia was standing at the front door with her canvas bag at her feet. The same bag she had arrived with in April, single-handled, slightly worn, at the strap where she had carried it, the particular shade of dark green that had faded in the 8 months since I had first seen it on a Tuesday morning, when Melissa had introduced her to me, like a piece of furniture. She was dressed in her own clothes, not the gray uniform, and she looked different in them, more herself. Less the role the way people look when they have stopped having to be something specific and can simply be. She looked up when I pulled in. She did not smile. She had the expression of someone who has made a decision and is waiting to see if it was the right one. I turned off the engine. I sat in the car for a moment, looking at her through the windshield, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not grief this time, not the cold weight I had been carrying since May, but something lighter. Something that felt cautiously like the first day of something rather than the last. I got out of the car. "You're leaving," I said. "I thought—" She stopped, looked at the bag at her feet. "The job is finished. I did not want to presume. You have your house back. You do not need Verstas, Sophia," I said. She looked up. I walked past her through the front door into the house. I went to the kitchen. I opened the drawer next to the stove, the one that had always held the spare keys, the one Margaret had labeled in her careful handwriting, on a piece of masking tape that had gone yellow and curled at the edges, but that I had never replaced because her handwriting was on it. Inside the drawer next to the spare key for the back gate and the key for the workshop padlock was a key I had cut 3 weeks ago at the hardware store on Foothill. I had put it there the same day I cut it, without telling anyone, because I had not known at the time whether I would use it. I knew now. I came back to the door. Sophia was still standing on the porch with her bag at her feet, watching me with an expression that was working very hard to be neutral, and was not entirely succeeding, something trembling at the edges of it, something she was holding very carefully in place. I held out the key. She looked at it in my palm. She did not take it immediately. Her eyes went from the key to my face and back to the key, and I watched the trembling at the edges of her expression become something that could not be held in place anymore, something that moved through her face the way weather moves across open ground, visible, unstoppable, honest. "The guest room," I said, "has never had a real guest. 8 months, and you were the only person who slept in it, and you were not. You were something else, something more useful than a guest." I paused. "If you do not have somewhere you call home, yet this place will always be yours. That is not a job offer. That is not charity. It is a fact about this house that I am informing you of." Sophia pressed her lips together. Her jaw tightened. She was fighting it hard the way people fight things that are too large and too welcome to arrive all at once without breaking something loose on the way in. She lost the fight. Her eyes filled and spilled over, and she brought her hand up and covered her mouth. And the sound she made was small and broken and entirely unguarded. The sound of someone who has been strong for a very long time, in a place where strength was the only option and has just been told that they do not have to be strong here in this specific place anymore. I placed the key in her other hand, the one that was not covering her mouth. Her fingers closed around it. I went inside to make coffee. I did not look back because some moments need to be private even when you are in the middle of them, and because the sound of her crying on my porch was not a thing I wanted to interrupt with my presence. It was hers. I left it with her. By the time the coffee was ready, I heard the front door open and close. I heard her set her bag down in the hallway, not pick it up, not carry it back out, just set it down. The small definitive sound of something being put somewhere it intends to stay. I took 2 cups from the cabinet. Margaret's cabinet with Margaret's cups in the kitchen of the house I had built with my own hands, and had come within a season of losing in the city where I had lived for 34 years, in the December afternoon that was just now going gold at the edges as the sun began its long, unhurried slide toward the San Gabriel Mountains. Sophia appeared in the kitchen doorway. Her eyes were red and still bright. She had her chin up and her shoulders back, which was how she always stood when something had just cost her something, and she had decided it was worth it. I held out a cup. She took it. We stood in the kitchen of the house on Oak Hollow Lane and drank our coffee while the December light came through the window and the clocks in the workshop ticked through the garage wall steady and unhurried, keeping perfect time the way they always had, the way they always would, long after both of us were gone. Outside, the pepper trees in the garden caught the last of the afternoon light and held it for a moment, golden and still and entirely at home. Inside, for the first time since Margaret left, so were we. That evening I went out to the workshop one more time. Not to work. I had not gone out there to work in a long time, not in the way of a man with a clock on the bench and a problem to solve anyway. I went the way I always went when I needed to think clearly, which was the same reason I had been going out there for 34 years, and the reason had not changed simply because everything else had. The amber light came on when I pulled the cord. Margaret's bulb. Still the same one, or one exactly like it. I had replaced it twice in 14 months, but always with the same wattage, the same warm tone, because some things you do not change, not out of sentimentality, but out of recognition that they were right the first time. I sat on my stool. I looked at the clocks. 347 mechanisms, each on its own shelf, each keeping its own time, no two of them running in quite the same rhythm, and all of them together telling the truth about the hour. I picked up the French mantel clock from 1887, turned it in the light. Looked at the crack along the base, that hairline fracture Margaret had told me never to repair. Imperfections make things more honest, Ed. She had been right. She had been right about most things, which had occasionally been irritating when she was alive, and was now in her absence something I had come to regard as one of the finer gifts she had left me. The memory of a woman who was usually correct, which gave me something reliable to measure against when I was not sure of my own judgment. I set the clock back on the shelf. I thought about Ryan. This was the part I had been putting off all day, sitting with it properly, without the structure of a courtroom or the company of another person to organize my feelings around. Just me and the fact of my son, 38 years old, in the California Department of Corrections, because he had made choices that could not be unmade. I had turned it over in my mind for months, looking for the precise moment when things had gone wrong, the gear that had slipped the spring, that had failed the fault in the load-bearing structure that I had missed or ignored, or chosen not to examine too closely. I had not found it. I suspected I never would. Some failures do not have a single point of origin. They accumulate over years in the small decisions and the overlooked signals and the moments when you choose the comfortable interpretation over the accurate one. That was a thing I was going to have to carry, not forever maybe, but for a long time. I thought about Melissa less than I expected to. She had been the engine of it, the cold, efficient calculation of a person who had decided that another human being was a resource rather than a life. But she was gone now, sentenced and removed, and what I felt in her absence was not triumph. It was something quieter. The way a room feels when a sound you had stopped noticing finally stops. I thought about Margaret the way I always thought about her in the workshop, not with the acute, jagged grief of the first months, but with something that had become over time structural. She was in this room, in the amber light and the arrangement of the shelves and the 1887 clock with its unrepaired crack. In the 34 years of accumulated life that had soaked into every surface of this house, the way oil soaks into wood, invisible, permanent, entirely present. I had promised her I would not let them take the house. I had kept that promise. I thought about Sophia. She had come here as a stranger, performing a role which was something I understood, well, having done it myself for 9 months. She had stayed because she possessed a quality I have come to believe is rarer than intelligence, rarer than courage, rarer than almost anything else. I can name the willingness to do the right thing when doing nothing would have been easier, and no one would have blamed her for it. She had stood in my kitchen and poured out a cup of tea. That was all. That was everything. There is a term in the clock trade, a French one, fitting enough for the moment when all the separate components of a mechanism finally come together and begin operating as a single integrated system. Établissement, the establishing. The moment when a collection of parts becomes, at last, itself. I thought that was what had happened in this house. A retired clockmaker, an immigrant woman with a secret, a 30-year friendship built on a lost auction bid, a conspiracy that had tried to dismantle everything and had instead, without meaning to set something new in motion. None of us had planned it. None of us had seen it coming. It had assembled itself the way the best things do, out of necessity and honesty and the particular stubbornness of people who refuse to accept that broken means finished. Margaret would have laughed at that. "You can plan all you wanted," she used to say, "but the best mechanisms are the ones that surprise you." I turned off the amber light. I sat for a moment in the dark with the clocks ticking around me, patient, steady, indifferent to everything that had happened in the 9 months just past, and I let the sound of them be enough. Time does not pause for human difficulty. Clocks do not mourn. The second hand moves forward regardless of what the people around it are going through. That used to seem cold to me. Tonight it felt like mercy. I walked back through the garden, past the pepper trees, up the back steps into the kitchen. The nightlight over the stove was on. The coffee cups from the afternoon were washed and upside down on the drying rack beside the sink. Sophia had washed the cups, 2 of them, side by side, clean and ready for tomorrow. I stood in the kitchen and looked at them for a long moment and felt something move through me that I did not need a name for, and turned off the light and went upstairs. I passed Sophia's door closed, a line of warm light underneath it, the sound of someone settling in for the night in a place they intend to be tomorrow. I went to my room. I lay down. I looked at the ceiling in the dark. There are things I know now that I did not know a year ago. I know that the people who say they love you are not always the people who do. I know that trust is not declared, it is demonstrated in small actions over time by people who do the right thing when no one is watching, and it costs them something real. I know that age is not weakness, it is patience. And patience, I have found, is considerably more dangerous than people expect when they have decided to underestimate you. I know that a house is not a structure. It is everything that has happened inside it. Every meal, every ordinary morning, every grief, every moment when someone chose to stay when leaving would have been easier. You cannot take that from a person with a forged document. The house is not in the deed. The house is in the walls and the floors, in the crooked door frame, and the amber light and the crack in the base of a clock that will never be repaired because some records are more valuable than the surfaces they mark. And I know this: the most precise instrument I have worked with in 65 years is not a clock. It is a person who has decided to be honest. If you have someone like that, someone who will stand in your kitchen and tell you the truth at considerable cost to themselves, take care of them. What they are giving you cannot be appraised or liquidated or replaced. It is worth more than any house in Pasadena. Outside, the December night was clear and cold over Oak Hollow Lane, and the pepper trees stood in the garden the way they always had, and in the workshop, the clocks ticked on, as they always would, long after all of us are gone. I closed my eyes. I was home. If this story reached you, if any part of it felt true to something you have known, tell me about it in the comments. I read everyone. And if you know someone who needs to hear that being old does not mean being finished, share this with them. Thank you for staying until the end. I have spent 65 years repairing broken mechanisms. But this family story taught me something no clock ever could, that the most dangerous damage is the kind that comes from inside your own home. Family betrayal does not arrive loudly. It arrives in warm smiles and cups of tea and someone who calls you darling while quietly dismantling everything you built. I was fortunate. I believe God placed Sophia in that house for a reason. Not coincidence, but grace arriving in a form I did not expect. So let me say this plainly from someone who lived it: do not wait. Do not confuse family loyalty with silence. Do not assume that love is real simply because someone says it is. Watch what people do when they believe no one is paying attention. That is where the truth lives. This family story reminded me that being old does not mean being finished. And this particular family betrayal, as painful as it was, gave me something I had not had in a very long time. A reason to wake up fighting. If this story moved, you share it with someone who needs it. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. And if you haven't already, subscribe. More stories are coming. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. A gentle note: the stories ahead contain fictional elements built purely to illuminate something true about the human experience. If that is not for you, no judgment. But if you choose to stay, I promise you will not regret it.